So, listen to this. Everyone knows Pele, Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, Neymar, you get the point. But there is one name that's known all across Brazil that barely anyone can recognize anywhere else in the world. I'm talking about Tener. And at one point or another, his name was mentioned alongside every single one of those players. Even Pele's very own son said that Tener had the speed and the skill of Neymar, the trickery and the spirit of Ronaldinho, and the efficiency of Ronaldo. We're talking about a player who impressed Maradona so much that he had to stop mid-match and applaud him. There's a reason he was known as the god of dribbling. However, as you might have guessed by now, Tener passed away at 23. Only days after his move to Europe had been finalized, and precisely 2 months before the 1994 World Cup started. Ronaldo was the last name on that squad list. He didn't play a single minute in the tournament, and still it was enough to change his career forever. Most believe that if Tener had been there, his fate would have been similar to Ronaldo's or any of those other players I've mentioned. But in the middle of all my research, there was one moment that really touched my heart. I heard someone claim that to this day, people are still naming their kids in his honor, so I looked up his name in a football database, and there it was. Up till the day he debuted for the national team, there were no other players with that name. But after that date, there were dozens, with the vast majority having been born in the years following his death. That's how much Tener meant to the people of Brazil, and those who saw him never forgot what he was like. Watching him play felt like catching a glimpse of a shooting star. And the first glimpse of his talent came in 1986. Having lost his father, 15-year-old Tener had quit football so he could help his mom with the bills. However, that year, a huge youth futsal tournament took place in his hometown. I'm talking live broadcast on TV and 7,000 people in the stands for the final. There are Champions League clubs averaging a lower attendance than that right now, so to the schools taking part in it, this was serious business. Which was why they sent out scouts to roam the streets looking for poor kids willing to play for a few bucks, and ended up finding Tener and offering him a scholarship. Except that, well, Tener never really showed up for class, so they were just paying him to play futsal. What they weren't expecting was that Tener was well aware of how good he was, so he sort of just began extorting them, refusing to show up for the match as if they didn't pay him more and more, and by the time he got to the final, he was making more money from futsal than he could ever make at a regular job. However, soon that would mean nothing, as Tener would take every trophy and award at the tournament, catching the eye of the likes of São Paulo and Portuguesa, his childhood club, eventually signing for the latter. But once there, they quickly realized there was a serious problem with him. Tener was a real street kid. Most days he didn't even show up at home. His family would literally watch every single one of his matches, as it was the only way they could make sure he was still okay. Even though most described Tener as a really funny, laid-back guy, his childhood friends were into some really heavy stuff and their behavior rubbed off on him. It wasn't rare to find stories of Tener stealing football boots or getting seriously aggressive during football matches. And at one point, things actually got much more serious than that, with the police arriving midway through a training session and taking Tener into custody, accusing him of armed robbery along with 5 of his so-called friends, only being released after 2 days and only because the club convinced the court that they would watch over him. However, like many other players, he would perceive this as impunity rather than as a second chance at life, and things would eventually get very serious once again. Still, soon after he was getting his debut for the club, impressing 2-time silver boot winner Alfinet so much that he asked for his shirt at the end of the match, only for Tener to tell him, "It's my debut and you're asking me for my shirt? These things cost like $500. Regardless, 2 years later, no matter how good he was, Portuguesa were kind of broke. They wouldn't even fully promote him to the first team despite the fact that he had already been playing with them for 2 seasons. But since Tener didn't want to leave his childhood club, he orchestrated a fake transfer to Belgium, taking his bluff as far as driving to the airport as if he was about to leave, leading the president to fold and hand him the contract. So, yeah, even if morally questionable, it was kind of genius, and it paid off massively for Portuguesa. Because soon after that contract was signed, in a Paulista Championship match, Tener took off from deep, dribbled past half the team and scored what is to this day considered the greatest goal in the history of the club. However, right after it happened, one of his teammates looked at him and asked, "What in the world have you just done?" And Tener simply replied, "Stop acting dumb. I score goals like this every training session." And after proving that right with plenty more iconic performances, the national team came calling. On his debut, Denner was so excited to come in that he ended up running into the pitch before the other player had come out, being forced by the referee to repeat the whole process. But even those shenanigans weren't enough to throw him off his game. Despite only getting 6 minutes on the pitch, he stepped into it, dropped deep, and started a counter-attack that allowed Brazil to tie the match. It was a seriously promising start, but soon after, Denner missed one of the biggest matches of the season after injuring himself trying to do wheelies on his motorcycle, and the media began hounding him, which only became worse once Brazil's under-23s missed out on qualification to the Olympic Games, with Denner being blamed for their failure. Denner was being seen as the front man in a team that included the likes of Cafu and Roberto Carlos. As unfair as his treatment was, it was also a testament to his greatness. Still, don't get me wrong, the media did to an extent sort of have a point. As his own hand once said, he thought that if he had a game the next day, getting 3 hours of sleep was more than enough. But the thing is, for Denner, it really seemed that was enough. There was this one time when no one could find him the day before a match against Santos. Everyone was worried, the manager was already setting up a new game plan to make up for his absence, and then, a couple hours before the match, he showed up like nothing had happened. He went into the match, and it was like he wasn't even there. By halftime, they were losing 2-0, and as one of his teammates said, I was sure that was it. We were gonna get thrashed 8-0 by Santos. However, in the locker room, the manager went crazy on Denner, blaming him for everything and eventually telling him he was gonna be subbed off. But at that moment, Denner looked him in the eye and told him, I'm not coming off. I'm gonna go into that pitch, and I am the one who says when the match is over. Once he finished that sentence, the whole locker room went silent. They could feel something was about to happen. And about half an hour later, Denner had led Portuguesa to come back 3-2. But it wasn't enough. Then he got the ball, put it in between the first defender's legs, beat the second one on the sprint, and slotted it in after dribbling the keeper. It was a masterpiece. By the time the final whistle was heard, he turned to his teammates and told them, I said what I said. I am Denner. Everyone here must understand this. I am Denner. In other words, he wanted them to know that he was him. Regardless, not even these kinds of performances were enough to draw the attention away from his bad boy persona. Over the next year, he arrived at training in a car covered in bullet holes. Then he was caught hiding a blade in his sock as he was supposedly planning on stabbing one of his teammates. As one newspaper called him, he was a brilliant vagabond. He had become one of the most infamous players in the country, and unfortunately, this cost him his place on the national team, even though he had the likes of two-time World Cup winner Pep claiming that he deserves more chances. In terms of raw talent, no player ever got this close to Pele. At this point, it was more clear than ever that Denner needed to get his act together, and the first step towards that was getting away from his hometown and getting away from his old friends. So he talked to Grémio, who had been dreaming about signing him for years but simply couldn't afford them, and worked out a deal for a 3-month loan. It all went incredibly well. They even won the Gaúcho Championship, but Denner's stock rose even further, and by the time he got back to Portuguesa, they too had fallen into the same predicament. His contract was nearing its end, and they just couldn't afford him. As the president would say, it was getting to a point where he almost earned more by himself than every one of his teammates put together. We were getting so desperate that at one point, half joking, half serious, I proposed signing away the stadium to his name. He would be the owner of all of this. We realized it was impossible to keep him here much longer. And it was at this point that Denner made a silly little suggestion that changed the route of his life. Denner said he would agree to renew his contract as long as the club could get him a Mitsubishi Eclipse as a sign-on bonus. It might seem like a small request now, but at the time, it was extremely hard to import cars into Brazil due to some really strict laws, so getting one was like finding a needle in a haystack. By the time Denner got the car, it was one of only a handful in the country. Everywhere he took his spaceship, as he liked to call it, people saw the all-white paint job with Denner 10 on the license plate and knew who it was. Little did they know he had just signed his death sentence. However, while all of this happened in São Paulo, it was something else that was happening in Rio de Janeiro that sealed his destiny. Back in 1989, a man named Eurico Miranda became the Brazilian national team's director of football, leading them to win the Copa America after a 40-year drought. However, 1 year later, he had already left. The problem was simple. He was also the vice president of Vasco De Gama, and he refused to let go of that position. Simultaneously, Jair Pereira, a manager who had led Brazil to 2 Under-20 World Cup titles, was sacked from Real Madrid after getting into a bit of an upset with the president. And it was right here that Eurico Miranda approached him trying to sign him and asked him, "Jair, do you want to be champions with me?" And Jair replied, "Yes, I'll make you a champion. I only have one demand, Denner." At this moment, Eurico's eyes widened. He was flabbergasted. Signing Denner was going to be his first suggestion. And as you might imagine, for Denner, who was desperate to right his wrongs and secure a place in the 1994 World Cup, joining them at Vasco was the perfect move. He was getting the exposure provided by joining one of the biggest teams in Brazil while also managing to get away from his hometown and clean up his image, while also catering to the wishes of two men who had great power over the national team. For once, he was making the right move. Or at least that's what everyone thought. On the first day of training, Denner was so excited that when Jair asked the players to start the session by running around the pitch, he darted away with such speed that once he reached the corner flag, he slipped, fell, hit his head on the ground, and passed out to the great amusement of every one of his new teammates. Regardless, this overexcitement translated well onto the pitch. How well, you ask? Let's just say that his debut against Newell's Old Boys is arguably the most iconic match of his entire career. That day, the focus should have been on Maradona. It was his first game back after being out injured for a few months. However, Denner had another plan. 6 minutes in, he took the ball and made it past 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 players, only barely missing out on the goal. That early into the match, Maradona was already shaking his head in disbelief, and Denner pretty much didn't stop until he was subbed off. It was so incredible that the next day, even the Argentine newspapers had Denner on the cover. But nothing was more shocking than when Maradona surprised the entire Vasco squad by barging into their locker room, asking for the kid. Maradona wanted to shake his hand. I don't think there is a bigger seal of approval than that. And the moment Diego left, Denner made sure to keep rubbing it on his friends' faces, saying, "Did Maradona ever ask to meet you? Didn't think so." Even 3 years later, when his teammate Ricardo Rocha ended up joining Newell's, the people still talked about that young boy who showed Maradona how it's done. It was especially ironic that a goalless match would end up being his most iconic. I mean, Denner was literally famous for saying that sometimes the dribble is more beautiful than the goal. Regardless, over the next few months at Vasco, Denner was on some of his greatest form ever, so much so that by the end, the fans had began chanting, "It's Cafuné, it's Cafuné. Denner is a mix of Garrincha and Pelé." However, what no one realized back then was that over that period, Denner was experiencing one of the lowest moments of his life. Despite the fact that he had 3 kids and financially provided for their mother almost as if she was his wife, Denner never actually got married to her and was completely open about the fact that he was dating other women. And only 1 month after arriving at Vasco, his girlfriend at the time passed away after being run over by a car during the carnival. Still, no matter what his mental state was at the time, only 2 months later, his performances had earned him his first move to Europe. At the end of the season, Denner would join Stuttgart for a sum of $3 million, but unfortunately, that move would never take place. Only 3 days after signing that contract and 16 days after his 23rd birthday, Denner, who had gone back to São Paulo for the negotiations, decided that around midnight that he had to go back to Rio immediately. Despite the fact he already had a plane ticket for the next morning, he refused to leave his famous Mitsubishi Eclipse in São Paulo, so, tired and with a 5-hour trip ahead of him, no matter how much his family kept insisting that he should stay the night, it didn't matter. 3 months earlier, Denner had met a man named Otto Miranda, a convicted arms dealer, alleged drug dealer, and personal friend of both Romário and Edmundo. Once again, Denner picked his friendships poorly and invited Otto to come with him to São Paulo. That day, no matter what Denner's family said, Otto repeatedly insisted that they could take turns sleeping while the other drove the car, and so it was. Before leaving, Denner picked up his phone and called one of his best friends, Edinho, a goalkeeper at Santos and, even more notably, Pelé's son. The two had met around 7 years earlier in a youth match. Denner scored past Edinho, the two struck conversation, ended up going out for pizza, and quickly became extremely close. However, that day, when Denner called, he seemed strange. He kept telling Edinho how much he loved him. Edinho insists to this day that Denner had to know what was about to happen. Regardless, at 5 a.m., already in Rio de Janeiro, only 20 minutes away from Denner's house, Otto fell asleep at the wheel, lost control of the car, and it collided into a tree. They were only going about 40 miles per hour, but unfortunately, while Otto's only injuries were 2 broken legs, the Ned had leaned his seat back too far, meaning that on impact, the seatbelt strangled him, causing his larynx to bleed, ultimately leading him to choke on his own blood. Somehow, the cameras got to the accident before the paramedics. The images of the Ned laying there with newspapers covering his face would be seen by everyone in Brazil. 13 days later, Ayrton Senna died as well, and that became easily the most tragic month in the history of Brazilian sports. Even more depressing, it took years in court before his family received the $3 million owed to them by their life insurance. Vasco had never actually filed the papers because, well, nobody dies at 23. To make all of this even more strange, Otto was assassinated months later.